I spent 5 years making sure no one from my old life could ever find me. I changed my address. I changed my phone number. I even changed the way I signed my name. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, a single envelope arrived at my flower shop. It wasn't from my ex-husband. It wasn't from anyone I recognized. But by the time I finished reading the first paragraph, I realized the life I'd buried wasn't finished with me, and what waited back home would destroy everything I thought I knew about my marriage. Before I tell you what happened, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let me tell you my story. My name is Natalie Prescott, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that starting over doesn't erase the past. Sometimes it simply puts enough distance between you and the pain that you can finally breathe again. I believed that's what I had done when I left Wolfboro, New Hampshire, 5 years earlier. I wasn't running from a place. I was running from a version of myself that had become unrecognizable. Every street in that town reminded me of broken promises, quiet tears, and the exhausting feeling of trying to convince someone that my feelings mattered. By the time I crossed the Vermont state line with everything I owned packed into the back of a rented truck, I had made one promise to myself. I would never go back, no matter what. Burlington gave me something Wolfboro never could: a chance to exist without constantly explaining myself. I rented a tiny apartment above an old bakery where the smell of fresh bread drifted through my windows every morning before sunrise. The floors creaked with every step, and the plumbing had a habit of complaining whenever I took a shower. But it was mine. No one criticized the way I arranged the furniture. No one questioned how much money I spent on groceries. No one sighed dramatically every time I laughed too loudly. The silence inside those four walls felt strange at first. Then it became comforting. Eventually, it became home. Starting over wasn't as romantic as people imagine. I worked double shifts arranging flowers for weddings I secretly cried through because I couldn't listen to another couple promise forever without remembering how quickly forever could disappear. I accepted every holiday order because I needed the overtime. There were nights I fell asleep at the kitchen table with unpaid bills spread out in front of me, wondering if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. But each difficult day also gave me something my marriage never had: confidence. It didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly. The first time I fixed a leaking faucet by myself. The first time I negotiated a better contract with a supplier. The first time I realized I had gone an entire week without hearing Brandon's voice inside my head, telling me I wasn't capable enough, smart enough, or strong enough. Healing wasn't dramatic, it was ordinary, and ordinary became beautiful. 3 years after arriving in Burlington, I opened my own flower shop. I called it Morning Bloom, because every flower seemed to remind me that new beginnings don't ask permission. They simply arrive. The shop wasn't large. 2 display windows overlooked Maple Street, and a weathered wooden sign swung gently whenever the wind picked up from Lake Champlain. Fresh eucalyptus hung behind the counter. White peonies lined one wall. Buckets of colorful wildflowers filled the back room every Thursday after deliveries arrived. People often told me the shop felt peaceful. I smiled every time I heard it because they had no idea that peace had once seemed impossible. By the 5th year, my life finally settled into a rhythm that felt dependable. I knew which customers preferred roses over lilies. I knew Mr. Henderson always bought yellow tulips on the anniversary of his wife's cancer remission. I knew Mrs. Donnelly would stop by every Friday afternoon just to tell me stories about her grandchildren before buying a bouquet she claimed made her kitchen feel less lonely. Little routines have a way of stitching broken lives back together. That Tuesday morning began no differently. The summer sunlight poured through the shop windows, warming the hardwood floor. Grace Holloway, my assistant, hummed softly while trimming stems in the workroom. A young couple spent nearly 20 minutes debating between ivory roses and blush-colored peonies for their engagement party. Around noon, I carried fresh lavender arrangements to the display table by the entrance and caught myself smiling for no particular reason. Life had become wonderfully predictable. Then the bell above the front door rang. I looked up automatically. A courier stepped inside holding a large certified envelope. "Natalie Prescott?" His voice echoed through the otherwise quiet shop. "Yes. I need your signature." I frowned slightly. I wasn't expecting anything. They usually don't tell people ahead of time. He offered a sympathetic smile that somehow made me even more nervous. After signing the electronic pad, I accepted the envelope and thanked him. The moment the door closed behind him, The shop felt unusually still. Grace noticed immediately. "Everything okay?" "I think so, but I wasn't sure." The envelope felt heavier than paper should. My eyes drifted to the return address. Parker and Whitmore Attorneys at Law, Wolfboro, New Hampshire. For a long moment, I couldn't move. 5 years. Not one letter, not one phone call, not one reason to think about the town I'd left behind. Yet there it was, resting in my hands as though the past had somehow learned my new address. I carefully opened the seal. Inside were several neatly folded documents. The first sentence made my heartbeat stumble. "Dear Ms. Prescott, we regret to inform you of the passing of Mrs. Judith Carter." I stopped reading. Judith, my former mother-in-law, the woman who had always treated me with quiet kindness, even when her son no longer did. I hadn't spoken to her since the divorce, not because I disliked her, because I believed staying away was the only way to truly move on. With trembling fingers, I continued reading. By the second page, the room felt as though it had tilted beneath my feet. Judith hadn't simply remembered me in her will, she had left me her lakeside cottage. Not Brandon, not another member of the Carter family. Me. Grace looked up from the workroom after hearing the papers slip from my hands. "Natalie? I don't understand." Before I could gather the documents, a smaller folded note slid onto the floor. Unlike the legal papers, this one was handwritten. I recognized the elegant handwriting instantly. Judith's. My chest tightened as I unfolded it. Only one sentence appeared on the page. "If you ever wanted to know why your marriage really ended, the truth is waiting for you inside the cedar chest." Every sound inside the flower shop disappeared, because in that moment, I realized something that frightened me more than seeing Brandon again. Someone had been keeping secrets. And Judith had taken them to her grave. Unless I was willing to return to the one place I had sworn never to see again. I must have read Judith's note 20 times before I finally folded it and slipped it back into the envelope. Each time I read those words, they seemed to carry a different meaning. If you ever wanted to know why your marriage really ended, not how it ended, I already knew how. I had lived every painful second of it. The arguments that started over nothing and somehow became my fault. The endless criticism disguised as helpful advice. The nights Brandon would stop speaking to me for days because I disagreed with him over something as insignificant as where to spend Thanksgiving. The loneliness of sharing a home with someone who made me feel invisible. I knew how my marriage had ended, but why? That was a different question. And one I wasn't sure I wanted answered. Grace quietly closed the shop door after the last customer left that afternoon. She didn't ask questions right away. She simply made 2 cups of coffee, placed one in front of me, and waited. It was one of the many reasons she'd become more than an employee over the years. She understood that silence sometimes came before the truth. Finally, she spoke. "Do you want to tell me what's going on?" I slid the attorney's letter across the counter. She read every page without interrupting. When she reached Judith's handwritten note, she looked up at me. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking someone made a mistake." "You don't believe that?" "No." "Then what?" I stared through the front window at people strolling down Maple Street, laughing as if the world hadn't just shifted beneath my feet. "I'm thinking Judith never did anything without a reason." Grace nodded slowly. "So, are you going?" The question settled heavily between us. 5 years ago, the answer would have been easy. Absolutely not. There wasn't a person alive who could have convinced me to return to Wolfboro. Not for a funeral. Not for money. Not even for closure. I'd spent years convincing myself I didn't need closure. Walking away had been enough, or so I'd believed. "I don't know," I admitted. Grace folded the note carefully. "If this were anyone else, I'd tell you to throw the letter away." She paused. "But it isn't." "No. It sounds like Judith wanted you to know something before she died." "I know." "Would you regret never finding out?" That question lingered long after she left for the evening, because deep down, I already knew the answer. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, memories I'd worked so hard to bury resurfaced. I remembered the first day I met Brandon. I was 29, he was charming, confident, and effortlessly funny. He noticed little things about me. The novel I carried everywhere. The fact that I always ordered tea instead of coffee. The way I tucked my hair behind my ear whenever I felt nervous. Being seen felt wonderful. Looking back now, I realize there's a difference between someone paying attention and someone studying you. The first year of our relationship felt almost perfect. He brought flowers to my office. He planned weekend trips. He made me believe I'd finally found the person I'd grow old with. The changes came so gradually I hardly noticed them. He suggested I stop spending so much time with my friends because they were a bad influence. He questioned why I called my sister so often. He laughed at my opinions in front of other people, then later insisted I was too sensitive. When I received a promotion at work, he congratulated me, then spent the next month reminding me how stressful the new position would be and how it might damage our relationship. Little by little, my world became smaller. My confidence became quieter. My voice became optional. If someone had asked me then whether I was being emotionally manipulated, I would have defended him. That's the cruelest part about relationships like ours. You don't realize you're disappearing until you've almost vanished. The next morning, I called the attorney listed in the letter. A receptionist answered almost immediately. Parker and Whitmore. My name is Natalie Prescott. A brief silence followed. One moment, Ms. Prescott. Within seconds, another voice came on the line. Ms. Prescott, this is Michael Parker. Thank you for calling. I received your letter. I assumed you might. I have questions. I expected that too. His calm voice somehow made everything feel even more serious. Why did Judith leave me the cottage? I'm afraid I can't answer that. Why not? Because she specifically instructed me not to. I frowned. What? Mrs. Carter left very detailed instructions. What instructions? She asked that you receive all explanations only after arriving at the property. So you know why. I do. And you won't tell me. I gave Mrs. Carter my word. Frustration tightened my chest. Mr. Parker, I haven't spoken to that family in 5 years. I understand. I built a new life. I know. I don't even know if I can face them again. His response surprised me. You may not have to. What does that mean? I'm only saying that Mrs. Carter anticipated your concerns. Did Brandon know about any of this? Another pause. I'm not authorized to discuss Mr. Carter. That wasn't a no. Which meant Brandon knew something, or at least he knew enough that the attorney couldn't answer. After we hung up, I sat motionless in my office. The room suddenly felt too quiet. On the shelf behind my desk sat a framed photograph taken during the grand opening of Morning Bloom. Grace stood beside me, both of us covered in dirt after planting flowers outside the entrance. I looked genuinely happy, not pretending, not forcing a smile. Actually happy. Was I really willing to risk all of that for answers? 3 days later, I found myself packing a small suitcase. Not because I wanted to go, because I couldn't ignore the feeling that if I didn't, Judith's final message would haunt me for the rest of my life. Grace insisted on driving me to the airport. You can still change your mind, she said as we unloaded my luggage. I know. No one would blame you. I know. She hugged me tightly. Just promise me one thing. What? If anyone makes you feel like the woman you used to be. She looked me directly in the eyes. Come home. My throat tightened. I will. 2 hours later, my flight landed in Manchester. I rented a car. As the highway signs counted down the miles to Wolfboro, my heartbeat grew heavier with each exit. 20 miles. 15. 10. Then, the familiar welcome sign appeared beside the road. Welcome to Wolfboro, the oldest summer resort in America. 5 years disappeared in an instant. Every memory I'd locked away came rushing back. The diner where Brandon had proposed, the bookstore where we'd spent rainy Saturdays, the church where we exchanged vows we couldn't keep. Nothing had changed, except me, or at least, I hoped it had. Then my phone rang through the car's speakers. The screen displayed an unfamiliar local number. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. A man's voice spoke before I could say hello. Natalie? I froze. I heard you were coming back. Only one person had ever said my name like that. Brandon. I've been waiting 5 years for this conversation. The sound of Brandon's voice sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cool New Hampshire air. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Not because I had forgotten what he sounded like, because I had spent 5 years making sure I never had to hear that voice again. Natalie? He said when I remained silent. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. How did you get this number? I asked Mr. Parker to tell me if you decided to come. I didn't ask how you knew I was coming. He hesitated. I still have your cell number. I changed it. You did. Then how? I recognized your voicemail greeting when I called the flower shop. I closed my eyes for a second. Of course. The shop's website listed the business number. He had called the store. Not me. Somehow that made me even more uncomfortable. What do you want, Brandon? I just want to talk. We have nothing to talk about. I know you probably hate me. This isn't about hate. It's been 5 years. I know exactly how long it's been. He let out a slow breath. My mother wanted you here. I know. I didn't know she'd leave you the cottage. I didn't ask for it. I believe you. His answer caught me off guard. Brandon had always argued, always defended himself, always tried to win. Now he simply sounded tired. I won't bother you, he said quietly. I just wanted you to hear this from me instead of someone else. Hear what? My mother wasn't the only one keeping secrets. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at the phone. No explanation, no goodbye. Just another mystery. Exactly what I didn't need. 20 minutes later, I turned onto the narrow lakeside road leading to Judith's property. The cottage looked exactly as I remembered. White cedar siding, dark green shutters, a wide front porch overlooking Lake Winnipesaukee. Judith had loved this house. She often joked that if heaven existed, she hoped it looked just like the view from her porch at sunset. I parked slowly. For several moments, I simply sat inside the car. The last time I'd stood in this driveway had been the afternoon I told Judith I was leaving Brandon. She hadn't tried to stop me. She hadn't defended her son. Instead, she'd hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. Then she'd whispered something I'd never forgotten. Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is leave before she forgets who she is. At the time, I thought she was simply comforting me. Now, I wasn't so sure. A black sedan pulled into the driveway behind me. Michael Parker stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. He looked to be in his early 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes that somehow made him seem more like a favorite uncle than an attorney. Ms. Prescott, Natalie is fine. He smiled gently. I've been hoping you'd come. I almost didn't. I know. He wasn't surprised. That told me Judith had expected me to hesitate. He unlocked the front door. The familiar scent of cedarwood and lavender drifted into the hallway. My chest tightened instantly. Nothing had changed. The old grandfather clock still stood beside the staircase. The faded quilt Judith had sewn decades earlier remained folded across the living room sofa. Family photographs lined the fireplace. Only now, one picture caught my attention. It wasn't there the last time I'd visited. Judith had framed a wedding photograph. Not of Brandon and me, of herself and her late husband. Beneath it rested a small handwritten card. The truth always arrives eventually. I frowned. What is this? Mr. Parker followed my gaze. Mrs. Carter placed that there about 2 months before she passed. Did she tell you why? No. He opened his briefcase and removed a ring of old-fashioned brass keys. Everything in this house now legally belongs to you. The words felt strange. I don't understand why. You will. When? He pointed toward the staircase. Follow me. We climbed to the second floor. Every creak beneath my feet awakened another memory. The guest bedroom where Brandon and I stayed during holidays. The hallway where Judith once taught me how to make her famous apple pie. The tiny reading nook overlooking the lake. It all felt frozen in time. Until we reached the attic door. Mr. Parker inserted one of the brass keys into an old lock. The hinges groaned as the door slowly opened. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight. The attic wasn't cluttered the way most attics are. Everything had been carefully organized. Shelves, boxes, labeled containers. Judith had always believed there was a place for everything. Near the far wall stood an antique cedar chest. Exactly as described in her note. Dark polished wood. Heavy brass hinges. A small envelope rested neatly on top. My name was written across the front. Natalie. My heartbeat quickened. Is this? Mr. Parker nodded. She wrote it the week before she died. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside was another letter. Unlike the first note, this one was several pages long. I began reading. My dear Natalie, if you're reading this, then you've been brave enough to come back. I never expected forgiveness from you, but I prayed you would give yourself one final gift, the truth. My eyes filled with tears before I reached the second paragraph. For years, I watched you carry blame that never belonged to you. I wanted to tell you everything many times, but I was protecting someone who did not deserve my silence. I stopped. What does that mean? Mr. Parker quietly looked out the attic window. I promised Mrs. Carter I wouldn't influence what you discovered. I looked back at the letter. Everything you need is inside this cedar chest. Read it slowly. Don't rush to judge anyone, not even my son. Some people made unforgivable choices. Others made impossible ones. The difference matters. I swallowed hard. Slowly, I lifted the heavy lid. The scent of aged cedar filled the room. Inside were dozens of neatly stacked journals, bundles of letters tied with faded blue ribbon, photographs, old bank statements, legal files, cassette tapes, and resting on top of everything, a sealed envelope. Across the front, in bold black ink, were 5 words that made my blood run cold. Do not let Brandon read. I looked up at Mr. Parker. What exactly was Judith trying to protect? He didn't answer. Before he could, footsteps echoed from downstairs. Both of us froze. Someone had just entered the house. Then a familiar voice called from the foyer. Natalie? Brandon. I know you're here. Every muscle in my body went rigid. I hadn't prepared myself to see Brandon. I told myself the drive to Wolfboro was about Judith, about honoring the woman who had shown me kindness when I desperately needed it, about reading whatever she had left behind. It was never supposed to be about him. Mr. Parker looked toward the attic door. You don't have to speak to him. I know. I can ask him to leave. For a brief moment, I considered it. I could stay hidden upstairs, read the journals, leave town before Brandon ever saw my face. It would certainly be easier. But easier wasn't always better. 5 years ago, I had walked away because I no longer had the strength to fight. Today, I wasn't running. I was simply different. I folded Judith's letter carefully, placed it back inside the envelope, and looked at Mr. Parker. I'll talk to him. He studied my expression for a second before giving a quiet nod. You seem stronger. I am. I think Judith knew you would be. We walked downstairs together. Brandon stood near the front door with his hands buried inside the pockets of a navy jacket. Time had changed him in small but noticeable ways. More gray at his temples. A few deeper lines around his eyes. He looked older than 43, not just physically, emotionally. The confident man I had once married seemed to have disappeared. When he saw me, he didn't move closer. He simply nodded. Hi, Natalie. Hello, Brandon. The silence that followed felt almost unbearable. There had once been a time when we couldn't stop talking to each other. Now neither of us knew where to begin. I'm sorry, he finally said. For what? For coming without asking. That's not what I meant. He looked down at the hardwood floor. I know. Mr. Parker quietly stepped toward the kitchen. I'll give you both a few minutes. As soon as he disappeared, Brandon spoke again. I wasn't sure you'd come. I almost didn't. I figured. I crossed my arms. What did you mean on the phone? His eyes met mine. When you said your mother wasn't the only one keeping secrets. He took a long breath. That's why I came. I waited. Instead of answering, he looked around the living room. My mother loved this house. I know. She always said she wanted it to belong to the person who appreciated it the most. Apparently that wasn't you. A faint smile crossed his face. No. It wasn't defensive. It was accepting. That unsettled me more than an argument would have. You should probably hate me, he said quietly. I don't spend my life hating you. What do you spend it doing? Living. The answer lingered between us. I'm glad, he said. I didn't come here for your approval. I know. Then why are you here? He reached into his jacket pocket and removed an old brass key. I think this belongs to the cedar chest. I frowned. There was only one lock. There's another compartment. I stared at him. You knew. I knew there was a hidden compartment. And you never told anyone? My mother asked me not to. Anger flared inside me. So she trusted you to keep another secret? No. His voice cracked. She wanted to make sure I couldn't destroy what was inside. I blinked. What? He placed the key on the coffee table. I've never opened it. Why should I believe you? Because if I had, he looked directly at me. I wouldn't be standing here asking you to read it. Before I could respond, Mr. Parker returned. Everything all right? Brandon nodded. I've said what I came to say. He turned toward the door. Brandon. He stopped. I hadn't even realized I was the one who called his name. Without turning around, he asked, "What?" I looked at the small brass key resting on the table. What am I about to find? His shoulders sank. The reason my mother stopped looking at me the same way. Then he walked out. The front door closed softly behind him. No shouting, no accusations, just silence. An hour later, I was back in the attic. The journals remained untouched. The photographs sat exactly where I'd left them. And now, the tiny brass key rested beside the cedar chest. I searched carefully until I noticed a narrow keyhole hidden beneath the inside lip of the lid. Judith had concealed it perfectly. I inserted the key. A soft click echoed through the attic. Then, a thin wooden panel slid open inside the chest. Behind it rested only 3 things: a worn leather folder, a small velvet jewelry box, and a sealed envelope addressed to me. My pulse quickened. I opened the envelope first. Inside was another letter from Judith. "Natalie, if you've found this compartment, then Brandon chose to give you the key. If he did, it means he has finally accepted that the truth belongs to you now." I frowned. Accepted? The next paragraph stole my breath. "You believed your marriage ended because Brandon stopped loving you." That wasn't the beginning of the story. I continued reading. "The beginning happened nearly 15 years before you met him." I lowered the page. 15 years? That made no sense. Judith continued. "Everything inside this compartment is connected to one decision made long before you entered our family." My eyes shifted toward the leather folder. Slowly, I opened it. Inside were financial records, property deeds, old insurance documents, and one newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local developer cleared after deadly construction collapse." The article was dated 16 years earlier. A photograph accompanied the story. 3 men stood outside a courthouse. One of them was unmistakably Brandon's father. Another was someone I had never seen before. The third made my heart stop, because it wasn't a stranger. It was my own father. I stared at the photograph so long my vision blurred. "No," I whispered. "That's impossible." Mr. Parker looked over my shoulder. His expression immediately changed. "You've reached it." I slowly turned toward him. "My father knew Brandon's father?" He nodded once. "Very well." I felt the room begin to spin. My father never mentioned the Carters. He wouldn't. Why? Mr. Parker hesitated. Then he quietly said the words that changed everything. Because both families spent nearly 2 decades pretending they had never met. For several seconds, I forgot how to breathe. I looked from the newspaper clipping to Mr. Parker, then back again, hoping the photograph would somehow change. It didn't. My father stood there in a dark suit, looking almost 20 years younger, beside Brandon's father, Richard Carter. The date beneath the photograph read April 17th, 16 years earlier. I had met Brandon 11 years ago. That meant our families had crossed paths long before either of us ever knew the other existed. "Tell me this is some kind of coincidence," I whispered. Mr. Parker slowly shook his head. "I'm afraid it isn't." My pulse hammered in my ears. My father never talked about Richard Carter. He had his reasons. And Brandon? Brandon didn't know the full story until a few months before Judith became ill. I stared at him. "So everyone knew except me?" "No." His answer came quickly. "Very few people knew the truth." "Then tell me." "I can't." Frustration washed over me. "You keep saying that." "I made Mrs. Carter a promise." "What kind of promise asks someone to watch another person suffer?" His face softened. "The kind made by a woman who believed you deserved proof instead of another person's version of events." I wanted to argue. Instead, I looked back at the cedar chest. Judith had spent months preparing this. Every document, every letter, every journal. She hadn't wanted anyone explaining the truth. She wanted me to discover it myself. I took a deep breath and reached for the first journal. The cover was worn from years of use. Inside the front page, Judith had written the date. January 3, 21 years earlier. I turned the page. Her handwriting was neat and steady. "Richard says we're finally putting the courthouse disaster behind us." I wish I believed him. 3 families buried people they loved. No jury found Richard responsible, but innocence in a courtroom isn't always innocence in your heart. I frowned. 3 families. Buried people. This wasn't simply a business dispute. Someone had died. I continued reading. Thomas Prescott testified today. I don't think he wanted to. My heart skipped. Thomas Prescott, my father. I whispered his name aloud before I could stop myself. Mr. Parker remained silent. I kept reading. He looked exhausted. Richard asked him to protect the company. I don't know whether he told the whole truth. I only know the verdict has left everyone pretending justice was served. I closed the journal. My father had testified. Against or for Brandon's father. Yet he had never spoken about it. Not once. Growing up, my father rarely discussed work. He owned a small engineering consulting firm and always claimed paperwork followed him home. As a child, I never questioned it. Now every memory felt different. How many conversations had stopped the moment I entered the room? How many secrets had been hidden behind closed doors? I rubbed my temples. This doesn't make sense. Mr. Parker nodded. It won't. Not yet. No. I decided to organize everything before reading further. The cedar chest contained far more than journals. One stack held family photographs arranged by year. Another contained legal correspondence. A third held handwritten letters tied together with faded blue ribbon. Near the bottom sat a small metal box. Inside were cassette tapes. Each had a handwritten label. Richard. Judith. Meeting with Thomas. Insurance interview. I stared at the labels. They recorded conversations? In those days, Mr. Parker said, people often used cassette recorders during meetings. Were they legal? They were never used in court. So why keep them? Mrs. Carter believed one day someone would need to hear them. A strange feeling settled over me. Judith hadn't collected memories. She had preserved evidence. Late that afternoon, I stepped onto the back porch overlooking the lake. The water shimmered beneath the fading sunlight. Everything outside looked peaceful. Inside the house, my entire understanding of the past was unraveling. I remembered visiting this porch during my first summer with Brandon. Judith had brought us homemade lemonade while Richard grilled hamburgers. We laughed. We played cards. I thought I had married into an ordinary family. Now I wondered whether everyone around that table had been carrying invisible burdens. I heard the screen door open behind me. Mr. Parker joined me. You should eat something. I'm not hungry. You've barely had anything all day. I keep thinking about my father. When was the last time you spoke to him? Almost 3 months ago. Does he know you're here? No. He looked surprised. You haven't called him? I didn't even know what to say. He nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps that's wise. I turned toward him. Wise? If Mrs. Carter wanted you to learn the truth in a particular order, I think you should respect that. I've spent years believing Brandon destroyed our marriage. You may still believe that when this is over. The answer caught me off guard. You think he did? I think marriages rarely collapse because of only one thing. His words lingered with me. Because deep down, I knew he was right. Brandon's choices had hurt me. Nothing could erase that. But Judith's letters kept insisting there had been something else. Something older. Something bigger than the two of us. That evening, I checked into a small inn overlooking the lake. Judith's house felt too heavy for my first night back. I needed distance. After unpacking, I ordered dinner I barely touched. Instead, I spread copies of the documents across the small table in my room. The timeline refused to leave my mind. 16 years ago, construction collapse, 3 deaths, my father's testimony, Richard Carter. Then, 11 years ago, I met Brandon. Was it really chance? Or had our paths crossed because of something neither of us understood? I picked up the newspaper clipping again. This time, I studied every face carefully. Then something caught my attention. Standing in the background, almost hidden behind a courthouse pillar, was a woman. She wasn't identified in the article. The photograph was grainy, but I knew that face. I had seen it somewhere before. Not in Wolfboro. Not in Burlington. Recently. Very recently. I searched through my phone. 5 minutes later, I found the picture I'd taken the day before at Judith's cottage. The framed family photographs. I enlarged one image. There she was. The same woman. Only older. She wasn't a stranger at all. She was the woman who had quietly attended Judith's funeral. The woman I'd assumed was just another family friend. My stomach tightened. Why would someone connected to a 16-year-old court case attend Judith's funeral? And why had she spent the entire service staring at me? Just then, my phone buzzed. A text message appeared from an unknown number. There was no greeting, no explanation, only one sentence. Stop reading the journals before someone else gets hurt. I read the text message 3 times before I accepted that it wasn't some kind of prank. My first instinct was to block the number. My second was to call the police. Instead, I simply stared at the screen. 5 years ago, a message like that would have sent me into a panic. I would have convinced myself I'd done something wrong. I would have wondered if I should apologize to someone. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I wasn't afraid. I was angry. Someone knew I'd opened the cedar chest. Someone knew I was reading Judith's journals, which meant someone had been watching. I immediately called Mr. Parker. He answered on the second ring. "Natalie? I just received a text." His tone changed instantly. "What did it say?" I read the message aloud. A long silence followed. Then he asked, "Have you told anyone besides me that you've opened the journals?" "No." "Not even Grace?" "No." "Did Brandon know you were staying at the inn?" "I never told him." "Stay where you are." "What?" "I'm coming." 25 minutes later, Mr. Parker knocked on my hotel room door. He looked more concerned than I'd seen him all day. Without saying a word, I handed him my phone. He studied the number. "I don't recognize it. Can it be traced?" "Eventually." He handed the phone back. "But I don't think that's the important question." "What is?" "How did someone know you had already begun reading?" The realization settled over both of us at the same time. Whoever sent the message either had access to Judith's house or had been watching it. Mr. Parker walked to the window and looked out toward the parking lot. "There were only 4 people who knew you'd be opening that chest today." "You?" "Yes." "Me," he nodded. "Brandon." "Yes, and..." He turned slowly. "Whoever else Judith trusted." That answer raised even more questions. "I thought she only trusted you." "So did I." The next morning, I returned to the cottage earlier than planned. Something felt different before I even unlocked the front door. The silence, the air, the strange feeling that someone had been there. Inside, nothing looked disturbed. The living room remained exactly as we'd left it. The kitchen was untouched. The attic door stood closed. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Mr. Parker arrived a few minutes later. "Did you move anything before you left yesterday?" "No." He looked around carefully. "Neither did I." We walked upstairs together. The attic appeared unchanged. Until I looked inside the cedar chest. The journals remained neatly stacked. The photographs hadn't moved. The legal files were still in place. But the small velvet jewelry box was gone. I searched every corner of the chest. Nothing. "It was right here," I whispered. Mr. Parker frowned. "I remember seeing it." "So do I." Neither of us had opened it. Neither of us had touched it. Someone had entered the house, taken only one item, and left everything else behind. Whoever it was knew exactly what they wanted. Mr. Parker immediately called the local sheriff. Within an hour, deputies photographed the attic and dusted for fingerprints. Unfortunately, the cottage had belonged to Judith for decades. There were prints everywhere. Nothing immediately stood out. As the officers worked, I wandered into Judith's bedroom. Everything remained just as she'd left it. Her reading glasses rested on the nightstand beside an unfinished novel. A knitted blanket covered the foot of the bed. Her favorite blue cardigan still hung behind the bedroom door. It was strangely heartbreaking. Judith had expected to die. She had organized every document, written every letter, labeled every journal. Yet she'd left her everyday life exactly as it was, as though she'd simply stepped outside for a walk. I sat gently on the edge of the bed. For the first time since arriving, grief finally caught up with me. I hadn't just lost a former mother-in-law, I'd lost one of the few people who had quietly loved me without asking me to become someone else. Tears slipped down my face before I realized I was crying. "I should have called you," I whispered into the empty room. I should have written. I had convinced myself cutting everyone off was necessary to heal. Maybe it had been. But Judith had never been my enemy. That realization hurt more than I expected. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. One of the deputies stood in the doorway. "Ms. Prescott?" "Yes?" "I think you should come downstairs." My stomach tightened. When I reached the living room, I found Brandon standing beside the fireplace. The deputies were questioning him. "I didn't take anything," he said calmly. "I came because Mr. Parker called me." The sheriff turned toward me. Do you know this gentleman? Yes. My ex-husband. The sheriff nodded. He says his mother owned a jewelry box that may have contained an engagement ring. Brandon looked at me. It wasn't jewelry. What? The box wasn't important. Then why did someone steal it? He hesitated. Because of what was hidden underneath it. Every eye in the room turned toward him. Mr. Parker frowned. What are you talking about? Brandon looked genuinely confused. My mother never told you? Told me what? He pointed toward the open cedar chest upstairs. The jewelry box covered a false wooden panel. I felt my pulse quicken. There was another compartment? Yes. How do you know? He swallowed. Because when I was 16, I accidentally found it. The room fell completely silent. Then Brandon said something that changed the direction of everything we'd uncovered so far. I never saw what was inside. My mother caught me before I could open it. He looked directly at me. She cried harder that day than I'd ever seen in my life. No one spoke. Then the sheriff's deputy called from upstairs. Sheriff, his voice echoed through the house. You need to see this. We hurried back to the attic. The deputy pointed to the bottom of the cedar chest. With the jewelry box missing, a tiny handwritten message had become visible. Judith had written directly on the wood. Only 6 words. The truth was never in here. For several seconds, no one spoke. We all stared at the words Judith had written on the cedar wood. If the truth wasn't in the chest, I asked quietly, then why leave me all of this? Mr. Parker's eyes remained fixed on the handwriting. Because she wanted you to ask that question. I looked at him. What are you talking about? He took a slow breath. Judith was a very deliberate woman. She knew someone might steal documents. She knew someone might break into this house after her death. I felt a knot form in my stomach. So she never would have hidden the most important evidence where everyone expected to find it. Brandon slowly lowered himself into an old wooden chair. He looked exhausted. My mother always said the safest place to hide something was in plain sight. The sheriff carefully photographed the writing before allowing anyone to touch the chest again. When everyone finally left the attic, I remained behind. I looked around the room one more time. Shelves. Old trunks, boxes, books, nothing stood out. Then my eyes drifted toward the window. Judith's favorite rocking chair sat exactly where she'd always kept it. Next to it stood a small table with a faded ceramic vase. Inside the vase were dried lavender stems. The same flowers Judith picked every summer. I walked over without really knowing why. As I lifted the vase, I noticed something folded beneath it. A single sheet of paper. It wasn't hidden. It was simply waiting. Across the top, in Judith's familiar handwriting, were 3 words. For Natalie alone. My heart pounded as I unfolded it. The letter was short. If you've reached this page, then someone has already searched the cedar chest. Good. That means my plan worked. I exchanged a stunned glance with Mr. Parker. Judith had expected the theft. I kept reading. People protect lies because they believe the truth will destroy their lives. They rarely realize that the lie has already done far more damage. A chill ran through me. The answer you're looking for isn't hidden in this house. I frowned. Then where? The final sentence answered my question. Go to St. Andrew's Church. Ask for Pastor William Hayes. Tell him I finally kept my promise. I looked up. Do you know him? Mr. Parker nodded slowly. I haven't seen William in years. Did Judith ever mention him? Only once. What did she say? His expression turned thoughtful. She told me if anything ever happened to her before she found the courage to tell you the truth. He paused. William already knew everything. St. Andrew's Church stood on the edge of town exactly as I remembered. A white wooden building surrounded by towering maple trees. The bell tower looked older than time itself. I hadn't been there since my wedding. Walking through those doors again felt strangely emotional. Not because I missed my marriage, because it reminded me how hopeful I'd once been. Inside, an elderly man arranged hymn books near the front pew. He looked up as we entered. Can I help you? Are you Pastor William Hayes? I am. My name is Natalie Prescott. His smile disappeared. For a brief second, genuine sadness crossed his face. I wondered if this day would ever come. You knew Judith. I knew her for over 40 years. I swallowed. She told me to give you a message. His hands tightened around the hymnal. What message? I repeated Judith's words exactly. She finally kept her promise. The pastor closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were filled with tears. "So," he whispered, "she's gone." I nodded. "I'm sorry." He sat quietly for a long moment before motioning us toward a small office behind the sanctuary. Once the door closed, he unlocked an old filing cabinet. From the bottom drawer, he removed a large brown envelope. Across the front was my name, dated 5 years earlier. I stared at it in disbelief. This was written after my divorce. Yes. Why didn't anyone send it to me? Pastor Hayes looked down. Because Judith asked me not to. Why? She believed you deserved peace before the truth. I felt my frustration return. Everyone keeps deciding what's best for me. I know. I'm tired of people protecting me with silence. So was Judith. He gently placed the envelope into my hands. That's why she finally chose differently. Inside the envelope was a handwritten confession. Not from Brandon. Not from Richard Carter. From Judith. I began reading. "Natalie, there is something I should have told you long before you married my son." The room became completely silent. "Your father did not destroy our family." I stopped. Everything I'd begun believing over the last 2 days suddenly shifted. I kept reading. Thomas Prescott tried to stop Richard from approving unsafe changes at the construction site. Richard ignored him. My heart raced. When the building collapsed, innocent people died. Tears blurred the page. "Your father wanted to tell the truth." I whispered, "Dad." Richard threatened to destroy his career and expose private financial information that would have bankrupted both families. My hands trembled. "So my father lied?" Pastor Hayes answered softly. "No." I looked at him. He compromised. "There's a difference." I continued reading. Thomas spent the rest of his life carrying guilt for surviving a decision that haunted everyone involved. I remembered every sleepless night my father had wandered the house after I was a teenager. Every quiet moment I'd mistaken for stress. Every distant look. He hadn't been hiding ordinary regrets. He'd been carrying them for nearly 2 decades. Then I reached the sentence Judith had underlined twice. "Natalie, Brandon never knew any of this while you were married." I froze. "What?" Mr. Parker leaned forward. "What does it say?" I read it again. Judith had been absolutely clear. Brandon hadn't known. The secret I'd believed sat between our families had never existed inside my marriage. I looked toward Brandon. He was standing near the church doorway. He'd quietly arrived a few minutes earlier without interrupting. His eyes met mine. "I told you," he said quietly. I didn't know. For the first time since returning to Wolfboro, I believed him. But one question still remained. If this secret hadn't destroyed my marriage, then what had? And why had Judith waited until now to tell me? For a long time, no one spoke. The silence inside Pastor Hayes' office felt heavier than any argument Brandon and I had ever shared. Judith's letter rested in my trembling hands, its final page still open, while Brandon stood quietly by the doorway. He hadn't tried to interrupt. He hadn't tried to defend himself. For the first time since I'd known him, he simply waited. I looked up slowly. "I believe you." His eyes widened. "What?" "I believe you didn't know about what happened between our fathers." He closed his eyes for a brief second, as though a weight he'd carried for years had finally shifted. "But," I continued, my voice steady, "that isn't the same as saying you didn't hurt me." His shoulders fell. "I know. You made me question my own memories. Every disagreement somehow became my fault. Every time I tried to explain how I felt, you told me I was overreacting." After a while, I stopped trusting myself. A tear rolled down his cheek. "I know. I spent months wondering if I was impossible to love. I know. I almost lost myself trying to keep our marriage together." His voice cracked. "I know. And I am so sorry. There were no excuses, no explanations, no attempt to rewrite history. For years, that was all I had wanted. Not perfection, not another promise, just someone willing to acknowledge the pain they caused without asking me to carry part of the blame." Pastor Hayes quietly stepped outside, leaving us alone. Brandon took a slow breath. "I started therapy 2 months after you left." I looked at him but said nothing. "At first, I went because I wanted someone to tell me you were wrong." A sad smile crossed his face. "Instead, my therapist asked why every disagreement felt like a competition I had to win." He laughed bitterly. I couldn't answer. He told me about the years that followed. about confronting the emotional patterns he'd inherited from his father, about learning that criticism wasn't communication, that silence wasn't strength, and that control had never been love. I became someone I never intended to be, he admitted. By the time I understood that, you were already gone. For the first time, I saw genuine remorse instead of regret over being left. There was a difference. I forgive you, I said quietly. His head lifted in surprise. But forgiveness doesn't mean I wish we'd stayed together. I understand. It means I refuse to let the pain follow me any longer. He nodded, tears filling his eyes. You deserved better than the husband I was. Those were the words I never expected to hear. And strangely, they were enough. As Brandon prepared to leave, the sheriff's deputy hurried into the church. Mr. Parker asked me to find you. My stomach tightened. What happened? We found the person who took the jewelry box. Less than an hour later, we returned to Judith's cottage. Waiting on the porch was the woman I'd seen at Judith's funeral. The same woman from the old newspaper photograph. She looked exhausted. Her gray hair was pulled into a loose knot, and she clutched the missing velvet jewelry box tightly against her chest. I'm Evelyn Monroe, she said softly. I worked as Richard Carter's legal secretary for nearly 30 years. I recognized the name immediately from several documents inside the cedar chest. You took the box, she nodded. I did. Why? Tears filled her eyes. Because I thought it still contained the recording. What recording? She slowly opened the jewelry box. It was empty. There used to be a tiny key inside. She looked at Mr. Parker. Judith moved it before she died, didn't she? He nodded. Months ago. Evelyn lowered her head. I was too late. My confusion only grew. Mr. Parker walked to the bookshelf in Judith's living room. Without a word, he reached behind a row of old gardening books and removed a small brass key taped to the back of the shelf. I stared at him. You knew? I didn't know where she hid it until this morning. He unlocked a narrow drawer built into Judith's antique writing desk. Inside rested a small digital recorder. Not a cassette, a modern recorder. Judith had transferred one conversation before she died. Mr. Parker pressed play. Richard Carter's voice filled the room. Though older than in the newspaper photo, it was unmistakable. I ignored the engineer's report because fixing the foundation would have cost millions. Thomas warned me someone could die. The room became completely still. The recording continued. I let him carry part of the blame because I couldn't face losing everything. Then, silence. I looked toward my father, who had quietly arrived after Mr. Parker called him. He stood frozen, his eyes filled with tears. I should have fought harder, he whispered. No, I said, taking his hand. You tried. I wasn't brave enough. You've punished yourself for 20 years. He broke down completely. I'm so sorry, Natalie. I hugged him tightly. I know. For the first time in decades, he wasn't carrying that burden alone. The sheriff quietly collected the recorder as evidence. Richard Carter had passed away years earlier, but the recording finally cleared my father's name. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive in time to change the past, but it can still free the people who survived it. The following morning, I returned to Judith's cottage one last time. Sunlight poured across the porch where we'd shared countless conversations over cups of tea. I walked slowly through each room, remembering the woman who had quietly loved me even when I no longer belonged to her family. In the kitchen, I found one final envelope tucked inside Judith's favorite cookbook. It was addressed simply, for whoever needs hope. Inside was a short note. Home is never a place that keeps you trapped. Home is the place that gives you enough love to leave stronger than you arrived. I smiled through my tears. Thank you, I whispered. Not just for the house, not just for the truth. For believing I'd someday be strong enough to carry both. That afternoon, I signed the papers donating the cottage to a nonprofit that provides temporary housing for women, rebuilding their lives after emotional abuse. Mr. Parker smiled. Judith would have been proud. I hope so. I don't hope. He looked out at the lake. I know. 3 days later, I unlocked the front door of Morning Bloom just before sunrise. The familiar scent of fresh lilies and eucalyptus welcomed me home. Grace looked up from arranging sunflowers. Without saying a word, she crossed the room and hugged me. You came back. I always was. Life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Customers laughed, flowers bloomed. The past no longer felt like something chasing me. It had become something I had survived. Looking back now, people sometimes ask whether returning to Wolfboro was worth reopening old wounds. My answer is always the same. I didn't go back to reclaim the life I lost. I went back to understand that losing it had saved me. Because the day my old life refused to let me go was the day I finally stopped letting it define who I would become. And that was the greatest gift Judith could have ever left me. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to leave part of your old life behind before you could truly find yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might encourage someone who needs it today. If you enjoyed this journey, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another heartfelt story. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, remember this: sometimes the life that refuses to let you go is only trying to give you the closure you need to finally move forward.